Hi, everybody. Thank you all so much for joining us today for our webinar discussing what to expect in process and performance management in 2026. My name is Kelly South, and I'm a research manager here at APQC, working in the process and performance management space. Today, we'll be discussing our latest survey, which sought to understand the top 2026 priorities and challenges in process and performance management. Before we get started, just a couple of reminders. Please feel free to use the Q&A feature or the chat to submit questions. And if we can't get to them at the end of the webinar, we'll be sure to follow up with them in our webinar follow-up. And we will be recording this presentation and we'll send a copy of the slides via email. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker for today, Madison Lundquist. She's the Principal Research Lead for Process and Performance Management here at APQC. Maddie, we're looking forward to hearing what you have to share with us.
Thanks, Kelly, and thanks to everyone that's joined us today. I've been watching all of the locations you guys are in come through chat, and we are all over the world, and I want to thank everyone for taking this time out of their day to spend with us and hear a little bit about the priorities and challenges for 2026. So let me go ahead and jump into our agenda and let you know where we're headed. We're going to talk about the priorities for 2026. We'll look at the evolution of process management and process management teams, and then we'll dig into how technology is enabling process management in this digital environment we have today. So first, let's look at the priorities and challenges for 2026. So according to the survey, here are our 6 top priorities and challenges according to our professionals that took the survey. We've got process management, continuous improvement, data and measurement, project management, strategic planning, and benchmarking. We see these 6 year over year. The percentages change a little bit, but these are core to process management, and we continually see them showing up. As we all know, AI, the digital landscape, is evolving rapidly, and I think that is a big change, but BPM itself and the fundamentals aren't changing all that much. If anything, throughout the webinar, you'll see and hear me mention a lot that strong foundation of process management is becoming super critical for organizations today. And now a little background on this survey. We conduct this survey annually. So throughout the webinar, I'll share both findings from this year's survey and then trends as well that are showing up as I look at the data year over year. Additionally, for each of these top priorities, I'm going to be sharing some sub priorities and challenges within them, as well as some guidance and APQC research to help organizations tackle those challenges. And anywhere that we have content directly related to that discussion, I've noted with a little text box that says available resources and links at the bottom of the slide. Just keep in mind, as Kelly noted, you'll get a copy of these slides and recording from the webinar within a few days, so don't feel the need to jot down everything. You'll get a link and you'll get a copy to the slides. So sit back, listen, and enjoy. Let's dig in here to the challenges specifically related to process management. So our 2026 data is signaling a clear return, like I mentioned earlier, to those fundamentals in process management. Now, organizations are focused on defining and mapping these end-to-end processes. They're moving from that function-based to process thinking culture, looking at their process maturity, strategic alignment, and establishing that process governance. Now, one of my favorite ways to look at priority data is comparatively year to year to see what patterns are surfacing. And it appears that organizations are continuing to focus on defining end-to-end processes and, more importantly, ensuring that those processes are tightly aligned to strategy. They're also putting more emphasis on developing that process thinking versus function thinking culture. And now, while this didn't show up as one of the top 5 priorities related to process management, I wanted to highlight here that the drop in concern that we're seeing around picking the right KPIs. Now, this may suggest that many organizations recognize that strong measures can only deliver that value when they're built on clear, well-governed, and strategically aligned processes. So let's dive in and look at how organizations should tackle these top 2 challenges. First, defining and mapping end-to-end processes. Now, to define end-to-end processes, you first have to understand what end-to-end processes are. And APQC defines end-to-end processes as the cross-functional processes that comprise all of those steps to accomplish a specific outcome or a goal. And key criteria for end-to-end processes include things like using an outside-in perspective, encompassing the entire value chain, focusing on the customer's value, and it categorizes processes based on value. Some common examples are order to cash, hire to retire, and idea to market. And the image you can see here on the slide are the 4 steps that APQC suggests organizations follow whenever you're working to create those end-to-end processes. You want to start by scoping and prioritizing, identifying and engaging your stakeholders, identifying process components, and don't forget to apply that entire lifecycle approach. Organizations who are looking to jumpstart these efforts on defining and mapping their end-to-end processes should definitely check out our collection around maps and measures that we have in the resource library related to end-to-ends. We have a large group of them, and we've done a lot of the heavy lifting for you so that you can start from something instead of starting from scratch on creating those maps, as well as identifying the KPIs. Moving into our second process management challenge, this priority has decreased in importance in 2025 and 2024. However, we've seen an increase in importance this year. Now, focusing on how work connects across functions rather than optimizing for an individual department can help organizations move toward that process thinking culture. And this mindset encourages shared ownership, stronger collaboration, consistent decision-making, and it helps support your common business outcomes. Building this culture requires simplifying process methods and languages, empowering your teams to improve their own work, and reinforcing continuous questioning of how and why work gets done. Organizations need to think about moving from the process team owns process to the business owns process. In this shift here, it's less about documentation and more about enabling these decisions, allowing improvements to happen more quickly, and enabling and encouraging people to become more accountable across the entire value stream. So the second priority organizations are focused on this year is continuous improvement. This is challenging for many organizations. Setting up this continuous improvement program or initiative often requires significant planning. You need resources, sponsorship, and don't forget that change management plan. And there's a lot that can go wrong along the way. Looking at the trend data year over year, there's a pattern I'm noticing. Earlier years tended to be more about alignment and prioritization, where this year we're seeing organizations, here we are again, returning to fundamentals like culture and systematic approaches. And if you dig a little bit deeper, culture is showing up as a long-term differentiator. Organizations aren't struggling as much with identifying or finding improvement opportunities as they are with building an environment that can sustain the improvements they've already made. Now, the slight drop here in 2025 and 2026 we see related to aligning efforts may indicate that organizations are moving away from alignment conversations to execution and culture building. So let's jump into how to build that continuous improvement culture. So building a sustainable continuous improvement culture, it requires leadership commitment and visible sponsorship. You've got to engage your employees. You need clear connections from business value and strategy. And you also need to do some training, some mentoring, and maybe even some recognition. Culture shifts can only happen when improvement becomes everyone's responsibility and not a single program's. Now, APQC has done a lot of research on continuous improvement and has had discussions with a variety of organizations. What I'm about to show here are just a few examples that I think are really valuable that organizations can learn from and attempt to adopt as they're working on building this continuous improvement culture. These are all linked down at the bottom of the slides, and I noted which organization the example was from. That way, if you want to go reference that link later, you can. So the first one here is creating these unified pockets of excellence by creating a global COP or community of practice and tying continuous improvement directly to their business value. So this global COP they created facilitated communication between employees in different offices, countries, and business units. And what it did is it broke down those barriers and it started to reduce the effects of silos. Their organization went from having just some pockets of continuous improvement that the enterprise hadn't fully recognized to creating this single global community where people are using the same language and methods to solve problems. The second example I saw was embedding continuous improvement into this recurring loop of encouragement, improvement, and reinforcement, which makes it more ongoing and not so single point in time. So this organization has great advice for those looking to drive cultures of continuous improvement, including, which I think is super important here, focusing on the psychological safety. We talk a lot about change, and a process improvement is a change, and these employees need to feel comfortable enough to be honest about what it is or what is not working, or where the process itself actually needs to be improved. They need to feel comfortable speaking up and explaining what part of their process isn't or is working. Also, you need to drive leadership's focus on improvement. The employees need to feel that they have the time to identify these improvements and also have the time to spend on making the improvements. Don't forget to give people permission to fail and also celebrate their successes. And then kind of an echo of the first example here is set up a COP. The last example I have here is about creating both a push and pull model. So providing these tools, but also making it easy enough for employees to initiate the improvement themselves. So building a continuous improvement culture was a central part of this organization's transformation effort. And at a higher level, the organization's continuous improvement goals targeted three main areas: process, shared services, and people. And in order to engage stakeholders and drive adoption, the organization created this poll that draws people in through the use of a self-service process improvement tool, as well as a portal to request services or submit ideas for those process improvement projects. So as we can see through these examples, continuous improvement culture can best grow when people feel safe, supported, and see that tangible impact. Moving into that second challenge that organizations encounter with continuous improvement is creating that systematic approach for identifying these opportunities. And believe it or not, there's not a one-size-fits-all approach for this. But APQC has done a little research, and we have 4 best practices that we encourage organizations use to increase the impact of their work. First is structure and governance. Consider what the structure of your team is and how you want to govern it. This will help clarify how the organizations can identify these improvements, how they'll prioritize them, and ultimately who's responsible for executing and sustaining them. Next, determine which criteria you're going to use. This is going to enable organizations to prioritize the most important improvements. The criteria should include considerations like projected savings and alignment with the organization's strategy. Third, have tactics in place to ensure the improvements are sustainable. Some examples you can have are regular check-ins, stakeholder management, as well as change management plans to ensure employees are actually buying into the change. And last but not least, decide how you're going to track the success. The measures selected should ideally align with the organization's broader goals and strategies. So we've talked about process management, we've talked about continuous improvement. Let's move in here to data and measurement. Now for 2026, the top challenges remain establishing that data-driven culture. Here we are again talking about culture in another category. And the culture part is consistent with 2025, and it's up actually significantly from 2024 and 2023. What I notice here is organizations are understanding the issue that it's not about access to the data, but it's whether leaders and employees are actually using the data to guide their decisions. The second major challenge here is around aggregating analysis into these dashboards to support that decision making. And this one's been pretty steady over the years. Another interesting trend here when we're looking year over year is around ensuring performance measures are relevant to the purpose. Now, this peaked in 24 at 31%, and it's started declining since then. So maybe organizations are moving past just asking, do we have the right KPIs? And they're now focusing more on how those KPIs are actually used in their day-to-day decisions, which lines up with some of those other priorities that I just mentioned. So let's talk about culture for a second here, this data-driven culture. Being data-driven means using good data to make objective decisions. And in order for organizations to be data-driven, they need to have processes in place to obtain this good data and be able to make their objective decisions based on the data. Often employees will ask themselves things like, what is good data? How do I find the good data? And what defines that objective decision-making? Creating that data-driven culture is not super simple and super easy, and it's not quick. It's this long-term undertaking, and it's going to require careful planning and preparation, top to bottom, widespread commitment, and enduring attention and effort. Now, as organizations prepare to make the shift to this data-driven culture, they need to consider these following change management tactics. Achieve a deep understanding of what the business needs. This is where you could do current state assessments. Don't underestimate the importance of that quality data. You need high integrity data. Otherwise, you could not be making decisions based on good data. Last but not least, speak in a language that your organization is going to understand. Gauge how familiar your organization is with data-driven decision-making, and make sure you tailor those communications accordingly. This includes using measures that have meaning and importance to your organization. The second data and measurement challenge highlights this organization's need to aggregate all of this analysis into a dashboard that supports decision-making. And I like to call these decision-ready dashboards. And I have 3 criteria for you to consider whenever you're creating these dashboards. The first one is reduce noise and friction. And employees were constantly demanded for a decision. We have data coming at us. We have changes coming at us all the time. Dashboards should reduce the pressure and not add to it. So make sure you're defining these effective dashboards by first understanding how they're going to be used. Work with your users, work with your stakeholders to identify the questions that employees expect these dashboards to answer, and then work to structure the views around those questions. And once you've done that, these dashboards are able to present information in a way that aligns with how your employees are going to think about their work, which can reduce that cognitive load and improve the decision quality. Second, they need to be able to provide context that is going to lead to action. They need to do more than just report the results. They need to explain what the data means. For leaders, dashboards should connect performance to business priorities and strategic outcomes. For those that are maybe closer to the work, dashboards should provide context that clarifies current performance and what that means, how the measures were derived, and what actions or process changes may improve results. And last but not least, you need to clarify some ownership and govern the data that is used in these dashboards. Clear roles need to be defined for both measurement and action, because some individuals are going to be responsible for just making sure the data and the measures on this dashboard are correct and accurate, while others are going to be accountable for taking the action when the performance shifts. Now, don't forget about data governance, because this also plays a critical role. You need particular data owners to be accountable for the reliability, accessibility, and usability of the data sources that are feeding these dashboards. Now, data and measurement was looking at getting us the right data to make decisions. And then we talked about continuous improvement and process management. Now let's go a layer deeper and talk about project management. So in 2026, the conversation seems to be shifting from execution to leadership. Our emerging priority here is developing project leaders, people who can translate strategy into action, navigate change, influence the stakeholders, and ensure that these initiatives are delivering meaningful business results. I think this shift is reflecting the increasing complexity of our environment out in the workforce today. Now, at the same time, defining success remains a persistent challenge. While organizations have improved at setting goals, there's still this tension around aligning project outcomes to real business impact, not simply delivering the outputs. Overall, I think project management is maturing. The focus is evolving from did we deliver the project to did we deliver value? And that takes strong leadership, clearer alignment to strategy, and tighter integration with portfolio and performance management decisions. Now, last year, as part of our strategic planning and organizational agility project, we worked on some content related to project management and the intersection of process management and project management. I had conversations with APQC's Jeff Varney, and he shared a great quote with me. Projects are temporary, but they run on processes. Strong process discipline makes projects faster, safer, and more reusable. And through these discussions I had with him, I was able to create a Venn diagram that represents where process management and project management intersect. And you can access this in our resource library. And we also talked about the implications of process management maturity on project management and how collaboration can make planning more effective. So let's dive into one of the top project management challenges, creating leaders instead of just project managers. Now, projects are the engines of change in most organizations. Strategies don't just come to life through policies or presentations. It comes to life through these projects. But here's the challenge. Many projects are delivered on time and on budget, yet they fail to deliver meaningful business value. The gap here isn't usually in the mechanics of the project management. It's in the connection between project work and the processes, performance goals, and outcomes that they're using to define success. And this is where the distinction between a project manager and a project leader becomes super critical. A project manager focuses on scope, schedule, budget, and coordination, where a project leader operates at this higher level, ensuring that what the project produces actually improves performance. That means understanding the processes the project is changing, anticipating any risks, adjusting when strategy shifts, and connecting these outputs to measurable business results. Embedding this process thinking into projects is key. Deliverables should map to core workflows, decision points, handoffs, as well as these control points. And whenever that connection is strong, the results are more durable and governance can focus on gaps rather than rework. Ultimately, projects are temporary, but the performance they're meant to improve is ongoing. So this strong project leadership helps bridge that gap. It ensures that when a project ends, the business doesn't just receive a deliverable, it gains this measurable improvement. And I think this is the mindset shift organizations need from completing these tasks to actually delivering the value. And we know from a lot of the research we did that a significant percentage of strategic projects fail to deliver the value organizations are expecting. And I mentioned this in the slide before, is that oftentimes projects seem to succeed on the outside. They've met their scope, their timeline, their budget targets. But those traditional metrics aren't telling us whether the project improved performance in a lasting way. So organizations need to shift how they're measuring project success. First, bring in process metrics. Time and cost matter, but they don't reflect this operational impact. If a project is intended to improve a workflow, we should be measuring the cycle time, the error rates, the throughput. Those metrics are going to tell us whether the change actually worked. Second, plan for ROI from day one. Define the operational outcomes that you expect at project launch, because too often teams disband at the project close without clearly handing off measurement ownership. And we all know if no one is accountable for tracking results, the value is going to erode. Third, build in these feedback loops into the project plan. Instead of waiting for a post-mortem, create structured checkpoints and buffer time to allow for course correction. Continuous monitoring increases the likelihood that the project stays aligned with the intended outcomes. And finally, define success by outcomes, not outputs. Deliverables alone don't create the impact. A documented process, a new system, or a completed implementation only matters if it's going to improve business performance. Projects should be evaluated based on what they enable, not just what they produce. So the real shift here is project completion is not the finish line, your sustained business impact is. All right, so moving on into our strategic planning priority, we've got two more. We've got strategic planning and benchmarking. So strategic planning, the data here shows organizations are navigating a tension between stability and adaptability. The top challenge is balancing the long-term and short-term goals, which shows leaders are under pressure to deliver these immediate results while still investing in transformation and future positioning. At the same time, we need to keep strategy flexible, and organizations recognize that the static annual planning cycles can't keep up with the changing market conditions. So we have to figure out how to revisit strategy more frequently, adding room to adjust based on these external signals. Overall, strategic planning is evolving. It's becoming less of a once-a-year exercise, and I'm seeing some shift towards some balancing acts happening here. In the data, we saw that one of the top strategic planning challenges is balancing the long-term and short-term goals. And that tension shows up consistently across organizations. So a natural question here is, what's driving that imbalance? When we look at long versus short-term planning more closely, one pattern stands out clearly. The number of objectives matters. Organizations with fewer objectives tend to emphasize long-term strategic priorities. But in contrast, organizations managing a high number of objectives skew much more towards short-term execution. It's not really about capability, it's about the mental bandwidth employees and organizations have. So when leadership teams attempt to pursue too many priorities at once, that strategic energy shifts towards near-term execution in this firefighting mode instead of a sustained long-term positioning. For many organizations, strategic planning still follows a familiar pattern. Leaders retreat once a year, produce a comprehensive plan, and then spend the next 12 months executing it against it, even as conditions are shifting around them. But the data is telling us that this approach isn't working well. Nearly half of the organizations we surveyed described their planning processes as at least somewhat ineffective. And many still rely heavily on top-down models that limit operational input. The result here is often a plan that looks polished, but lacks that coordination and agility. So how do we move forward? How do we start to improve? Organizations we see that are building agility treat planning as this living system rather than a once-a-year task. They establish predictable review cadences, intentionally limit their objectives to a very manageable number, and they're requiring teams to demonstrate how those priorities align to enterprise goals. They also bring operational leaders into the planning process early, ensuring that that frontline insight shapes the direction rather than reacting to it after the fact. Sorry, I'm trying to catch up on chat here. The core shift here is cultural as much as it is procedural. We need to make this shift from strategy being a static annual document to being more of an ongoing discipline. We need to integrate our learning, our coordination, as well as this real-time insight as we develop this more agile planning process. We are moving into one of our last priorities here, which is benchmarking. So the challenges in 2026 reflect a shift from questioning its value, moving into more operationalizing benchmarking effectively. And our top issue remains pretty consistent here as identifying the right benchmarks and their sources. It tells us that organizations aren't struggling with whether to benchmark. They're struggling with its relevance and its credibility. In this very crowded data environment, selecting the meaningful, comparable data sources is becoming pretty complex. And finding the right organizations to compare against also remains a core challenge. Do I compare with similar organization in the same industry? Do I look outside my industry? Do I look in the same peer group? There's a lot of considerations to be made. And if we're looking at the year-over-year data, planning and scoping benchmarking activities and integrating benchmarks into reporting mechanisms is starting to rise again. So I'm starting to think that organizations are understanding the value of benchmarking, and they're moving beyond these isolated studies toward a more holistic approach to benchmarking. So let's dig into the top two challenges here. I briefly touched on this just a minute ago, but when organizations decide to benchmark, they often tend to look outward to find the high-performing companies and learn from them. But effective benchmarking can start internally. Before you reach out, organizations need to clearly define the processes they want to improve and understand what their performance gaps actually are. If they're not clear from the start, benchmarking just becomes this exploratory effort rather than something strategic. A structured partner selection approach helps ensure that you're choosing organizations that truly align with your priorities, not just ones that seem impressive. And once you've identified who your partners are, success then depends on this ethical and reciprocal collaboration. Benchmarking should follow a clear code of conduct with transparency around expectations and information sharing. It's definitely a two-way exchange of value. And finally, follow through is super critical. Insights need to be documented, shared, and also translated into action. Benchmarking without this implementation piece is just an interesting discussion. Moving into our next section here on the evolution of process management, let's see where we've been the past few years. So looking at the presence of process teams, we see an interesting pattern. Process team adoption peaked, at least when we look just at these years, it peaked in about 2024 when more than 80% of organizations reported having a formal team. Since then, we've actually seen a modest decline and we're stabilizing right around 70% in 2026. I don't think this necessarily means organizations are moving away from process management. I think it might be more of a structural shift. Potentially, organizations could be decentralizing their process ownership, and others may be evolving their operating models as they become more mature. Now, I don't have this chart displayed on the slide, but I wanted to note what we're seeing in the longevity of process teams. In 2026, we saw fewer teams being newly formed compared to prior years, and the surge of establishing new process management teams appears to have slowed down a little bit. What we are seeing is growth in teams that have been in place for more than a decade. So the conversation seems to be moving a bit from should we have a process team to how should our process capabilities evolve to continue driving strategic value. And speaking of driving value, on our survey, we asked organizations what the top needed changes are in the process management discipline. And here are the top 5, looking at them year over year. It appears that process management is starting to be reshaped or influenced by outside forces, especially things like digital transformation and AI. And process management can no longer operate as this static or purely internal function. It needs to evolve to keep pace with all of these technologies, the speed at which change is happening, as well as these pressures to reduce costs and become more efficient. Organizations that are able to modernize their process capabilities are going to be a lot better positioned to translate these digital investments into real performance gains. And looking at some of our top needed changes, improving process management here isn't just about the tools themselves. It's about changing how people work together, how process integrates with IT, and the skills that we're bringing to the table. The breadth of needed changes signals that many process functions might be under-equipped for today's digital and cross-functional demands. We need to address these gaps holistically to be super effective at turning process efforts into this sustained business impact. So we see skill sets here as one of the top needed changes. So let's dig a little bit more into that. We ask our survey participants what skills they think are necessary in order to stay relevant in the process management function. And here are the top 5. The most in-demand capabilities here aren't super technical. They're very human-centered, analytical, and influence-driven. Design thinking, rising to the top here, tells me that process teams need to focus on their customers and employee experience, not just building their workflow or process map. They need to consider empathy and innovation, not just, is this process the most efficient it can be? Change management, we've talked about it a lot today. Ranking high here reinforces that designing a better process isn't enough. Teams need to drive adoption and actually influence behavior change. Analytics makes sense. We've got this growing expectation that process professionals translate data into insights and guide their decisions with evidence. Storytelling is important here. It's something that's been bouncing around on the top 5 here, and it shows up in our cohort with the knowledge management folks as well. It signals that process teams need to communicate in ways that are resonating with leaders and frontline teams alike. You need to work on this strong narrative to get the buy-in for your process efforts and your process changes. If we look at all these skills together, we can see that the process management function is evolving from this pure documentation to more strategic enablement for the organizations. If you're able to invest in some of these skill sets, your process work is going to be more relevant, more credible, and impactful in driving that real change. Our last section of the presentation today is how technology enables process management. We asked a few questions around digital solutions related to process management. And this data shows something very clear. Organizations are not hesitating to invest. There's an extra question, I don't have it on this slide specifically, but more than 80% of our respondents plan to invest in digital tools and technologies in the next 18 months. So obviously, organizations are confident that these digital capabilities are going to drive the performance, make them more competitive, and help them have long-term growth. And if we dig in and look at where these investments are going, AI and cognitive computing lead the way. Not super shocked there. It's followed closely by process automation, and these priorities reflect this strong push toward efficiency, scalability, and smarter decision-making. We're also seeing some investments here in data management and advanced analytics, which is important because AI and automation are only going to be as effective as the data that's fueling them. As we move down the list here, process mining and intelligent BPM suites also appear on the list. which suggests that many organizations are trying to gain this visibility into how work is actually happening, not necessarily just how it's designed. And what I notice here is this concept, which we've talked about it a little bit throughout the presentation so far, is digital tools don't create value on their own. If you just take AI and layer it on top of a broken process, it's just going to accelerate your inefficiency. Or automation applied to unclear workflows just makes those mistakes happen a lot faster. It is super critical that organizations have clean data, well-defined processes, and this strong governance in place. Without those foundations, digital investments risk becoming expensive experiments rather than performance drivers. So as we move through this section, I'm not wondering if people are investing, because obviously they clearly are. The question to me is whether they are investing in these foundational capabilities that allow their digital solutions to truly deliver the impact, which is where process management, data governance, and cross-functional alignment becomes critical enablers of digital success. So on the previous slide, we saw that organizations are heavily investing in digital solutions, particularly AI, automation, and analytics. But investment and integration are two very different things. This slide shows the reality of where most organizations stand when it comes to integrating their digital tools or digital and AI tools across functions. Only a small percentage report being fully integrated, where digital and AI systems are connected across functions, enabling this smooth, automated end-to-end workflows. Instead, the majority fall into this partially integrated category. That means some systems are connected, but gaps remain that hinder this efficiency. These gaps often show up as manual workarounds, duplicate data entry, disconnected dashboards, or even delays between departments. Another portion also report being minimally integrated or not integrated at all, where tools are operating in silos or requiring manual transfers or coordination across teams. The fragmentation here limits the very benefits organizations are hoping to achieve through all of these digital investments. AI just layered onto siloed systems cannot optimize the end-to-end performance. So the next step here is making sure all these investments are working together. On the survey, we asked organizations their top challenges faced when implementing digital solutions, and those are shown here. The biggest barriers to success aren't the technologies themselves, they're integration, clarity of value, and people-related challenges. The top challenge is integrating with existing systems, which is consistent with what we saw earlier. Organizations may adopt new AI or automation tools, but if those tools can't connect effectively with their legacy systems, they end up creating friction rather than speeding up the work. We also see resistance from employees and lack of skills to use new tools, which reinforces something super critical. Digital transformation is as much about the people as it is about the platforms. If teams don't understand the value or don't feel confident using the tools, adoption is going to stall. And I didn't use the term here, but change management is critical for implementing all these digital tools and communication. So to close out this digital section, I feel like this slide brings everything together. While most organizations are investing in digital tools and AI, very few actually describe themselves as fully prepared to adopt and scale those technologies effectively. Nearly half fall into this moderately prepared category. It means they have some systems and practices in place, but adoption is inconsistent. This is the middle of what some people would consider a readiness curve, where the intent is super high, but the execution is super variable. A smaller portion are reporting being fully prepared and proactive in adoption. And on the other end, a meaningful percentage still face a capability or mindset gap that limits their ability to implement these new technologies successfully. Which tells me that the barrier isn't ambition. Organizations are eager and they want to modernize. but they're stuck still building the governance, the skills, the integration, and this change readiness to move from reactive to sustained enterprise-wide improvement. So as we step back and look across the 2026 priorities, a few themes clearly are emerging. First, culture and leadership matter more than the tools. Whether we're talking about continuous improvement, data-driven decision-making, or project success, the challenges are less about frameworks and more about alignment, clarity, and influence. Second, organizations are shifting from expansion to focus. We see tension between long-term and short-term goals, and we see goal overload limiting the impact. The discipline now is prioritization, choosing fewer, higher impact objectives and executing them well. Third, process teams are evolving. The data suggests fewer new teams are being created, but more teams are starting to reach higher maturity levels, which indicates process management is stabilizing as an enterprise capability. People aren't wondering whether or not to have a process team. They're now focusing strategically on how to structure it and integrate those capabilities across the entire organization. Fourth, digital investment is accelerating. AI, automation, and analytics are some of the top priorities. But integration challenges, unclear ROI, and adoption gaps are showing that technology alone is not driving transformation. Enterprise integration and governance are what is going to help unlock that value. Finally, sustained impact requires connection. Strategy needs to link to your process design. Projects need to link to measurable outcomes. Data needs to inform your decisions in real time. And digital tools need to be embedded into end-to-end workflows. In 2026, high-performing organizations are not treating these disciplines separately. They're integrating strategy, process, data, projects, and digital into this cohesive operating model. That integration, not a single tool, a single person, a single function, or a project, is what is going to define performance leaders moving forward. So with that, we've got about 10 minutes left. I will open it up for questions.
Thank you so much, Maddie. Really appreciate the presentation. It was super informative. So far, we've got one question in the Q&A. If anyone else wants to submit any in the next couple minutes, feel free. When you were talking about strategic planning, we had someone ask, I've always used a balanced scorecard to align projects and initiatives to strategy as key building blocks between strategy and operations, and wanted to know if you would discuss that or if you have anything to say on that topic.
Sure. I didn't have plans specifically in the slides to cover that at any point throughout the webinar, but I think balanced scorecards are great. Some other tools that you can use is a measurement alignment worksheet. So looking at the measures that you're going to use and tying them to your strategic objectives is another great tool. And I believe we have some content on balanced scorecards in the resource library as well, if you want to dig into that more.
Yes, and I saw another question come in asking if you'll receive the slides in a recording. You will in a couple of business days. All right, we've got a couple more questions now. Would it be okay to say that for a complete business transformation, we should focus on people, process, and technology?
I think you should focus on those, but not only those. There's a lot of other components, especially with a complete business transformation and making sure that whatever transformation is happening, you have the right people on the transformation team, making sure you have key stakeholders identified, you have update cadences. Especially if it's a complete business transformation, you need a well thought out project management or a project plan with a strong project leader. And that will definitely take your transformation in the right direction.
Let's see. We've got a question asking, how would you see the integration that you identified surface in organizations? And he gives examples of structure changes, metric changes, customer integration to the process, etc.
Yeah, that's a super, super good question. I think this speaks to reducing silos throughout the organization. So, if you want to work to integrate, you've got to have an integrated team making decisions together. It doesn't mean you have to have multiple meetings with everybody in one room, but maybe you have some asynchronous work happening and you all come together to make some core decisions. And then also sharing common goals. So, maybe you've got four different functions and they all have an individual goal that relates to their function. But in order to have this integrated approach moving forward, these four functions need some sort of goal to work on together just to drive a little more value and some what's in it for me perspective on that.
Thank you. And I'm going to type an answer to Jeff's question about the sample size and everything. But if we want to cover another one while I'm doing that, we have a question asking, why is benchmarking not at the top of the business agenda? Is there a fear of being compared against metrics?
That's a really good question. I don't know if I can fully answer your question only because we didn't ask a question, why don't you benchmark? Are you scared to benchmark? Any questions like that? But I do have to say, it typically, if you're looking at our 6 priorities related to process management specifically, so our organization does these priority surveys in all of our functions. I would be interested to ask, in your organization overall, what's your top priority? I can't answer that question. But and related to process management specifically about benchmarking, I don't think that people are scared necessarily about it. I think they just have so many other competing priorities that that's where it naturally falls in that top priority list.
Okie Let's see. What advice would you give to a company that has many areas for improvement, but focuses more on improving processes rather than building a culture oriented toward change and continuous improvement?
And if you'll leave that question there for a minute so I can refer back to it. So I'm rereading to make sure I understand the question. More on improving processes rather than building a culture oriented toward change. I think this is one of those sticky situations where you're going to have to embed some change management tactics into these process improvement efforts. You may not be able to say, we are going to shift our entire culture toward continuous improvement, but maybe create some standardization, if you will, to how you're improving processes. So maybe the Shumash enterprise example about providing the tools to the organization for a little bit of standardization, and then also having an intake process for people to recommend some of these improvements. It may inch your way toward a more continuous improvement approach versus just improving a process.
Awesome, thank you. Let's see what we have left. Do these concepts apply as discussed today for smaller organizations with less resources, or do you have any sort of adjustments or modifications you think might work for a smaller organization?
I think the biggest question there will be, how do you want to structure your process efforts to be able to carry out the tasks you want that function to complete? Maybe at a smaller organization, a decentralized process function would be the way to go, and find some core process folks throughout the organization that can meet maybe as a community of practice to implement some of these standards throughout the organization or these approaches. So I think based on your organization size, you really need to think through the goals of the process management function and what structure is going to work best to meet those goals.
Let's see. Any other questions left?
I see one
Anything?
question about any advice for having the same process running globally, but in different ways using different SAP versions. I can't speak as much to the SAP, but I can talk about a global process and then the variations that apply. I think the best thing to do there is to look at the parts of the process that are the same globally and the differences and see what could be aligned. Maybe they're happening in different ways throughout the different regions or the different locations or different headquarters, things like that, because the variations have just naturally started occurring. So is there a way you could standardize that back to a more global process? Or do the differentiate or the variations actually need to happen? And if so, explain why, show the common part of the process and then where the variations are applying, and figure out where to align on what variations are okay versus not.
Any other questions you're seeing that you want to address, Maddie?
I will address that last question real quick about before going for transformation projects, should we go for a leadership alignment workshop? I don't know if that's what you will call it or if that's the right framing for it, but before you embark on any transformation, you definitely need the leaders to be aligned because they're going to be the ones reinforcing the changes that are happening, giving that executive sponsorship point of view. They're going to be encouraging other leaders to participate in the transformation. So if you don't have them aligned, you're already off on the wrong foot, I personally think. So definitely get a charter together for this transformation, get all of your leadership aligned. That way there's a coherent view on the path forward.
Great. I think we've covered almost all of the questions that we've gotten today, and we're just about at time. Any final words you want to share with us, Maddie, before I wrap it up?
No, I'll just say that we've got a ton of content on what we talked about today. You'll get a link to the slides and recording, so be sure to check out all of our related content related to the webinar. And thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you so much. Have a great day, everyone.